How did 300 heavily armed Spaniards vanish without a trace in the swamps of Florida? In the spring of 1528, a fleet of conquistadors landed on the coast of North America. The soldiers hoped to find rich cities and tons of Native American gold.
But they encountered an enemy that could not be pierced by a steel spear.
The expedition's commander, Panfilo de Narvaez, made a fatal mistake. He ordered 300 infantrymen and horsemen to leave the safety of the ships. The force moved inland, believing vague rumors of treasure. The Spaniards, clad in heavy iron armor, stepped into the endless labyrinth of the jungle. Their war horses sank chest deep into water and rotting vegetation. Instead of squares paved with gold, the conquistadors found only impassable swamps. Every kilometer of the journey through the swamps drained the soldiers of their last ounce of strength.
Their supplies of food and fresh water were rapidly running out.
The proud conquerors had become exhausted men, surrounded by thousands of mosquitoes. How did a powerful European expedition end up trapped in this deadly trap? And what was the cost of attempting to cross these wild territories? But the most terrible catastrophe lay ahead for Narvaez's expedition. The Florida sun turned the conquistadors' steel armor into scorching furnaces. The Spaniards' greatest advantage suddenly became their deadly curse in this humid and stifling climate. The metal heated up so much that it mercilessly burned the skin beneath the quilted jackets. Heavy iron cuirasses inexorably dragged the soldiers down as they crossed numerous rivers and deep streams. Every step in such gear required enormous effort and very quickly drained the men of their last reserves of strength. The terrain proved completely unsuitable for the movement of heavy cavalry. War horses broke their legs, sinking into pits and tangles of roots hidden beneath the murky water. The animals sank deep into the swampy mud and refused to go further into the jungle. The proud Spanish horsemen had to dismount and drag their horses by the reins through the foul-smelling sludge.
The loss of every horse became a real tragedy for the weakened detachment.
300 infantrymen struggled to hack their way through dense thickets and prickly bushes. Sharp leaves cut their faces, and swarms of gnats relentlessly stung the exhausted men. After a whole day of hard work with axes and machetes, the column had advanced only a few kilometers. The journey was exhausting the conquerors to the point of near death. Any hope of an easy and quick march had evaporated within the first few days of the expedition. The hardtack and salted meat taken from the ships ran out very quickly. The provisions spoiled due to the intense heat and constant humidity of the forests. The Spaniards had hoped to find wealthy Indian settlements and replenish their food supplies there. However, it turned out that the narrow Indian trails did not lead to rich cities of gold at all. Instead of fabulous riches, the conquistadors found only empty straw huts. All around lay only endless poisonous swamps and stagnant, putrid water. The tall jungle closed in tightly behind the column, blocking the way back. The Spaniards found themselves in a veritable green trap with no clear landmarks. Driven mad by thirst, the soldiers drank dirty swamp water straight from the puddles. Because of this, they immediately fell ill with severe fever and intestinal infections. Disease began to mow down the expedition's ranks faster than any weapon.
The expedition's officers saw the impending disaster and begged Panfilo de Narvaez to turn back immediately.
They asked to return to the coast while the men still had the strength for a long march. But the stubborn commander was blinded by a thirst for gold and continued to drive the exhausted army further north. He made the fateful decision to move deeper into the mainland and lost contact with his fleet for good. The conquistadors cut off their only reliable path to salvation with their own hands. The ships had sailed far along the coast in search of a suitable harbor, leaving the soldiers to fend for themselves. 300 armed Europeans were stranded deep in uncharted and wild territory. They had not a crumb of food left, nor any real chance of retracing their steps. The wild forest around them seemed completely empty, but soon from the dark thickets, strange eyes began to watch the Spaniards closely. The last scraps of salted meat ran out by the third week of the grueling march. Raging hunger was rapidly destroying the iron discipline within the Spanish unit. People began boiling leather belts and chewing tree bark just to survive. The exhausted soldiers no longer looked at their officers with their usual respect and fear.
Military discipline had completely dissolved into an animalistic desire to find even a scrap of food.
Nighttime stops turned into brutal fight. Yesterday's comrades in arms were now ready to kill each other over an edible root. The Conquistadors' stomachs were completely empty, and their minds clouded by a high fever. The harsh orders of a distant king meant nothing in these cursed swamps. Military regulations had given way to the brutal law of the jungle. Soon, 2-meter-long reed arrows flew out of the thick morning fog. The Appalachian Indians had no intention of engaging in open, fair combat with the armored infantry. They knew every bush in their forest intimately and skillfully exploited this advantage. The warriors attacked silently from the thick undergrowth and instantly vanished into the green vines. Their powerful bows pierced through the Spanish armor with terrifying ease. The Spaniards simply couldn't keep up with raising their heavy muskets, lighting the fuses, and loading them. The Conquistadors' weapons proved completely unsuited for rapid forest skirmishes.
The gunpowder had become damp from the constant rain, and the fuses went out at the worst possible moment.
Reloading took too long, during which time the Indians managed to fire dozens of arrows. The invisible enemy methodically shot at the stretched-out column of conquerors from all sides. Each such sudden ambush left dead and seriously wounded soldiers on the narrow, swampy trail. The wounded groaned in pain and severely slowed the entire detachment's progress. Carrying them on stretchers through waist-deep mud was practically impossible. The healthy warriors were forced to make a terrible choice and leave their comrades to die. The army's morale was finally shattered by these constant losses. Panfilo de Narvaez had completely lost control of his men, who were driven mad by fear. The commander ran along the ranks, shouting at the soldiers and threatening the mutineers with immediate hanging. He tried to restore order through brutal punishments, but it no longer worked. The horror of a slow death by starvation and enemy arrows proved far stronger than the fear of execution. The leader's authority collapsed just as quickly as the hopes of riches. Dozens of infantrymen abandoned their useless heavy weapons and deserted straight into the impassable swamps. They were driven mad by the strain and wandered alone deeper into the forest. The fugitives desperately hoped to find at least some game or make their way to the sea on their own. But in the murky waters, they found only their own deaths at the jaws of alligators or in Indian traps. The swamps mercilessly swallowed up those who strayed from the main group. Now the vast jungle and local tribes were waging a truly merciless hunt against the Spaniards. Of the 300-strong Europeans, only half remained, exhausted, wounded, and sick. The situation seemed utterly hopeless from every angle. Every kilometer traveled cost the party more lives and more bloodshed. To simply survive and see the saving sea again, the remnants of the expedition had to resort to utter madness. 250 surviving Spaniards finally reached the shore of the Gulf of Mexico. There was no way forward. Behind them lay the deadly jungle, and ahead raged the open sea. The desperate conquistadors made a mad but only possible decision.
They planned to build a fleet without a single nail, an experienced carpenter, or a proper shipyard.
The soldiers fashioned bellows from wooden tubes and deer hides. They lit huge bonfires right on the damp sandy beach. Steel helmets, heavy crossbows, and cavalry spurs were thrown into the flames. From the red-hot metal, the blacksmiths forged primitive axes, saws, and fasteners. The conquistadors wove sturdy ropes from horse manes and palm leaves. The ragged infantrymen sewed their last linen shirts into 5 rough sails. Every 3 days, the army slaughtered 1 warhorse. The horse meat fed the emaciated lumberjacks and carpenters. From the skinned hides, the Spaniards sewed field water bags for drinking water.
Under torrential tropical rains, the men worked day and night until the water began to erode the shore.
Finally, 5 fragile 10-meter-long barks touched the water. With great difficulty, 50 men climbed aboard each boat. Due to the monstrous overload, the wooden sides of the vessels rose only a hand's breadth above the waves. Panfilo de Narvaez ordered the sails to be hoisted, and the makeshift fleet set sail from the hostile shores of Florida. The soldiers believed that the worst ordeal was already behind them. But on the open sea, a completely new disaster awaited this overcrowded fleet. 5 overloaded boats crept slowly along the coast of the Gulf of Mexico. The Conquistadors had neither navigational charts nor compasses. Their supply of fresh water, stored in the sewn-together horse hides, quickly turned foul. The merciless sun scorched the European skin until it blistered and bled. Corrosive sea salt ate into the infantrymen's open wounds. Driven mad by thirst, the soldiers began drinking salty seawater. They died in terrible agony right there on the wooden benches. The Spaniards could see the land of salvation, but were afraid to approach the shore. Hundreds of armed Native American warriors were already waiting for them there. In early November, a powerful storm struck the coast. The icy wind and huge waves instantly scattered the fragile fleet. Commander Panfilo de Narvaez's raft was torn from its anchor. The storm carried it out to the open sea, never to return. The remaining 4 boats were thrown onto the sandy shoals of modern-day Texas. The vessels were smashed to pieces by the impact against the shore. About 80 surviving conquistadors found themselves on a cold autumn beach. They had lost their weapons, their clothes, and the last remnants of their pride. The exhausted and frozen Spaniards were surrounded by local nomadic tribes. The Karankawa Indians did not regard the Europeans as powerful gods at all. Yesterday's proud conquerors were quickly turned into powerless slaves. Now the conquistadors dug for edible roots from morning till night. For the slightest offense, the overseers brutally beat them with heavy sticks. Of the 300 well-armed soldiers, only a pitiful handful survived. Their grand quest for gold had turned into a humiliating captivity. But even at the very depths of despair, 4 Spaniards refused to give up. They conceived a plan to undertake an unimaginable trek on foot across the entire unexplored continent. The 4 surviving Spaniards spent 6 long years in humiliating slavery. They were the officer Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, 2 soldiers, and the Moroccan slave Estebanico. Nothing remained of their European clothing and steel armor. The men worked from dawn to dusk under the brutal blows of sticks. One day, their masters ordered the emaciated captives to heal the sick Indians. If they refused, they were threatened with having their meager rations taken away. Cabeza de Vaca began reciting fervent Catholic prayers over the dying. He baptized the sick and blew on their wounds, mimicking the movements of shamans. Suddenly, several seriously ill Indians rose to their feet. Word of the incredible miracle spread instantly along the entire coast. The locals, fearing the wrath of the gods, stopped beating the Spaniards and lifted the guard. Yesterday's powerless slaves unexpectedly gained the status of great healers. 4 captives seized the opportunity and secretly left the tribe's encampment. They set out on foot toward the west across the endless prairies. The Spaniards hoped to find Christian colonies somewhere in central Mexico. The most epic overland trek in American history had begun. The travelers walked completely naked across the sun-scorched plains. Sharp thorns tore at their bodies and their skin cracked deeply. The soles of the Europeans' feet became calloused and hard as tree bark. Often, for an entire week, they ate only a few dried lizards. On hungry days, the conquistadors had to subsist on bitter roots and earth spiders. But step by step, they stubbornly pressed deeper into the unexplored continent. Over the years of slavery, the Spaniards had mastered 6 Native American languages. This allowed them to move safely from one tribe to another. The fierce warriors lowered their bows and respectfully let the travelers pass through their lands. Every new village greeted the quartet with food and gifts. The resounding fame of the white shamans preceded the procession. Soon, dozens and hundreds of Native Americans began to join the Spaniards. Over time, this devoted crowd grew to 3,000 people. The vast nomadic army moved slowly through deserts and rocky gorges. The locals voluntarily gave the Europeans their most valuable possessions. The Indians dared not touch the food without personal permission from Cabeza de Vaca. The surviving conquistadors once again gained absolute power over thousands of people. But now they ruled the crowd without heavy muskets and iron swords. In the spring of 1536, 2 completely different worlds met near the Sinaloa River. The 4 surviving conquistadors finally saw their compatriots after 8 years of wandering. But this long-awaited reunion brought no joy to Alvaro Núñez Cabeza de Vaca. A well-armed Spanish patrol led by Captain Diego de Alcaraz rode out to meet the travelers. The horsemen, clad in steel, were deliberately hunting down the Indians for easy profit. They wanted to chain the locals and send them as slaves to the silver mines. Captain Alcaraz was simply stunned when he saw the incredible sight before him. 4 completely naked, deeply tanned men with matted hair emerged from the thick bushes. Behind them stood a loyal crowd of 3,000 Native American warriors. Cabeza de Vaca addressed the patrolmen in fluent Spanish. He sternly demanded that the illegal manhunt be stopped immediately. Alcaraz's officers refused to believe that this savage was a noble Castilian nobleman. Once the initial shock had passed, the mounted patrolmen tried to attack Cabeza de Vaca's Indian companions. A bloody battle nearly broke out between the Spaniards on the narrow, dusty trail. The former slaves resolutely blocked the path of their cruel and greedy compatriots. Cabeza de Vaca ordered the Indians to immediately return to the mountains and hide. The enraged Captain Alcaraz arrested the rebellious compatriots and sent them south under guard. In July 1536, the strange procession finally entered the colony's capital, Mexico City. The local viceroy organized a lavish celebration in honor of the soldiers who had miraculously survived. The governor presented the wanderers with the finest European clothing and assigned them luxurious bedrooms. But Cabeza de Vaca was physically unable to wear stiff velvet doublets. For a long time, he continued to sleep on the bare floor, ignoring the soft feather beds. Soon, the former royal treasurer returned to Europe and wrote a detailed report to Charles V. In his book, he boldly emerged as the chief advocate for the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Cabeza de Vaca urged the crown to stop the senseless slaughter and show Christian mercy. It was a daring and unprecedented act for the harsh era of the Conquistadors. The vast colonial empire reluctantly, but nonetheless, heeded the words of the surviving officer. The 4 castaways returned home as heroes, but brought the crown not gold, but only a harrowing experience. But what was the real financial cost of this colossal disaster to the Spanish treasury? King Charles V invested a fortune in Pánfilo de Narváez's expedition. A powerful army of 600 armed soldiers landed on the shores of Florida. Only 4 exhausted vagabonds returned home. The Spanish treasury did not receive a single ounce of Indian gold. Instead of chests of treasure, Cabeza de Vaca brought back terrifying tales. He described to the emperor impassable poisonous swamps and thousands of deadly arrows. For many decades, Spanish conquistadors forgot the way to the northern territories. The familiar tactics of brutal conquest had failed completely. Iron swords and heavy muskets were no match for the wilds. Vast lands from Florida to Texas remained unconquered. Spanish cartographers drew the empire's new borders only on paper. Not a single military garrison could establish a foothold in these hostile jungles. Later, French and English colonists landed on these unclaimed shores. The blind pride of the commanders cost the Spanish crown control over an entire continent. In Madrid, Álvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca attempted to become the new governor of Florida. He sincerely wanted to return across the ocean and govern the local tribes peacefully. But the arrogant royal advisors merely mocked the humane ideas of the former captive. Influential ministers refused to listen to a nobleman who had lived among the Indians for years. A vast empire rejected the most important lesson in its bloody history. Cabeza de Vaca's dream of justice was shattered by the greed of officials. Thus ended the most disastrous and astonishing expedition in the history of the New World. Cabeza de Vaca honestly told the king about his terrible wanderings. In his report, the officer casually mentioned the large Native American cities in the north. Greedy European listeners instantly distorted these simple words. In their fevered imaginations, clay roofs turned into the 7 golden cities of Cibola. Thousands of new adventurers believed in the beautiful fairy tale of untold riches. This fateful legend soon killed more people than all the poisonous swamps of Florida. In 1539, the ambitious captain Hernando de Soto landed on the coast. He brought with him 600 heavily armed knights and infantrymen. At the same time, Francisco Coronado led another massive army deep into the mainland. The conquerors once again willingly stepped into the terrifying emptiness of the wild continent. The soldiers desperately searched for the glittering golden temples from the tales of Cabeza de Vaca. But history cruelly repeated itself. De Soto's expedition proved to be incredibly bloody and destructive. Armored cavalry spent years hacking their way through dense forests and impassable swamps. The Spaniards burned Indian villages to the ground and shackled the locals in iron collars. The overseers fed the rebellious captives to their enormous war dogs. But after traveling thousands of kilometers, the army did not find a single gold nugget. The lands of North America turned out to be rich only in endless forests and fresh water. The golden mirage dissolved into the thick morning fog. Hernando de Soto fell ill with a severe fever and died on the banks of the Mississippi. That night, the exhausted soldiers secretly cast their commander's body into the dark river. The pitiful remnants of the once great army returned to Mexico with great difficulty. The Spanish Empire finally realized the bitter and cold truth. For years, the crown had spent millions of pesos and hundreds of lives chasing a phantom. The disaster that befell Narvaez's expedition forever altered the fate of an entire continent. The first shots fired from Spanish muskets destroyed the trust between the two worlds forever. The local tribes saw the Europeans as nothing but cruel and greedy invaders. The foundation for centuries of bloody wars was laid right here in these swamps. Now, on every coast, strangers were met with a hail of sharp reed arrows. This was no ordinary military setback for a handful of men. The pride of a mighty empire was shattered by the wilds. The 4 survivors walked through hell to bring this bad news. Their blood-stained footsteps charted the course for future wars and the borders of modern states. And the heavy steel cuirasses of 300 conquistadors were left to rust forever at the bottom of the swamps. Royal accountants in Spain calculated the final losses with horror. 5 enormous galleons rotted away forever in the poisonous swamps of Florida. The crown lost 600 well-armed soldiers and 100 thoroughbred war horses. In the 16th century, each such stallion was worth a fortune. The military training of an experienced infantryman required many years of training and a generous salary. All these colossal state investments literally sank into impassable muddy sludge. Exhausted Spain did not receive a single gold coin from this massive venture. Enraged colonial officials finally realized their fatal mistake. The greedy pursuit of illusory treasures brought the great empire nothing but monstrous debts. But for the indigenous peoples of the continent, the consequences proved far more dire than financial losses. Spanish soldiers were unable to establish a foothold in the new wild lands. However, their brief contact left behind an invisible and deadly trail. The coughing conquistadors brought European smallpox and severe measles to the continent. The local tribes had absolutely no immunity to these overseas infections. Soon, a merciless epidemic spread rapidly along the entire coast. Huge, thriving villages were completely wiped out in just a few terrible weeks. Indigenous shamans lit bonfires, beat drums, and chanted ancient prayers. But no rituals could quell the cruel fever. Invisible microbes destroyed entire peoples far more quickly and effectively than gunpowder. The only tangible result of the catastrophe was the remarkable book by Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca. In the quiet of a Madrid study, the former captive wrote his famous Naufragios. The officer carefully transcribed onto paper the details of daily life and the languages of dozens of indigenous tribes. He preserved the memory of those people who would soon vanish without a trace due to disease. Instead of chests of precious stones, King Charles V received only a handwritten manuscript. Historical chronicles have forever deemed Pánfilo de Narvaez's expedition an absolute failure. The pride of the heavily armored conquerors was shattered by the untamed wilderness. The cost of this harsh lesson proved unbearably high for both worlds. After the terrible demise of Pánfilo de Narvaez's expedition, Spanish sailors began to fear the shores of Florida with panic. The dense northern jungles gained a terrifying reputation as cursed land. For decades, not a single European ship dropped anchor in those murky waters. The surviving veterans refused to don their heavy cuirasses again and venture into the poisonous swamps. This long lull gave the Native American tribes precious time to prepare for a new war. The chiefs of the nomadic peoples began making thousands of arrows and uniting scattered bands of hunters. They stared intently at the empty horizon, awaiting the return of the white men in their enormous floating houses. In the luxurious palaces of Havana and Mexico City, genuine panic broke out. The Spanish governors no longer wanted to send soldiers to certain death for the sake of illusory gold. King Charles V, in a rage, stripped all the greedy officials who had financed the failed expedition of their posts. Influential ministers rapidly lost their cushy positions and were sent into disgraceful exile. For the first time, the vast empire felt its vulnerability in the face of wild and merciless nature. Hundreds of dead infantrymen at the bottom of Florida's swamps became the harshest lesson for the Spanish crown. This bitter experience forced the Europeans to completely change their tactics. Instead of heavily armored conquistadors, unarmed Catholic monks were now sent north. They carried only wooden crosses and holy books in their hands, instead of sharp steel swords. The empire attempted to build new colonies through quiet preaching rather than bloodshed. The monks built wooden missions and tried to peacefully baptize the fierce warriors. But the deep wounds from the first encounter between the two worlds never healed. The Indians would forever remember the barking of the Spanish war dogs and the lashes of cruel whips. The ashes of the burned villages poisoned relations between the peoples for hundreds of years to come. The catastrophe of Narvaez's expedition became the very fateful turning point that forever divided the history of an entire continent. Today, archaeologists find only rusty fragments of Spanish swords in the swamps of Florida. The murky quagmire has forever swallowed the remains of the once great army. Modern people have turned the terrible deaths of hundreds of soldiers into mere adventure tales. But the brutal truth still lies deep beneath a layer of rotting leaves. The wilds easily broke the most powerful military machine of the 16th century. Steel armor and heavy muskets proved utterly useless against tropical fever. Commander Panfilo de Narvaez's blind stubbornness cold-bloodedly killed his loyal officers. The grand dream of European kings for endless gold drowned in the cold mud. The story of this mad expedition became a harsh lesson for new generations of conquistadors. Ordinary human greed led experienced, armed warriors into a deadly green trap. And now every pierced cuirass found in the sand silently reminds us of the true price of excessive pride.